Hello and welcome to our video summarizing all you need to know about utilitarianism as a theory and key theorists Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. My name is Sarah, and in this video we'll look at a proper definition of this theory along with the approach that both theorists took for this notion. This video is very useful, especially if you are studying utilitarianism as part of your course or exam, as we'll get into the details you need to know to get top marks. So let's get started. So first, an overview. Utilitarianism is one of the most powerful and persuasive approaches to normative ethics in the history of philosophy. Though not fully articulated until the 19th century, proto-utilitarian positions can be discerned throughout the history of ethical theory. Though there are many varieties of the view discussed, utilitarianism is generally held to be the view that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good. There are many ways to spell out this general claim. One thing to note is that the theory is a form of consequentialism. The right action is understood entirely in terms of consequences produced. What distinguishes utilitarianism from egoism has to do with the scope of the relevant consequences. On the utilitarian view, one ought to maximize the overall good. That is, consider the good of others as well as one's own good. The classical utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, identified the good with pleasure. So, like Epicurus, were hedonists about value. They also held that we ought to maximize the good, that is, bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is also distinguished by impartiality and agent-neutrality. Everyone's happiness counts the same. When one maximizes the good, it is the good impartially considered. My good counts for no more than anyone else's good. Further, the reason I have to promote the overall good is the same reason anyone else has to, so promote the good. It is not peculiar to me. All of these features of this approach to moral evaluation and or moral decision-making have proven to be somewhat controversial, and subsequent controversies have led to changes in the classical version of the theory. Now onto the classical approach of utilitarianism. The classical utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, were concerned with legal and social reform. If anything could be identified as the fundamental motivation behind the development of classical utilitarianism, it would be the desire to see useless, corrupt laws and social practices changed. Accomplishing this goal required a normative ethical theory employed as a critical tool. What is the truth about what makes an action or a policy a morally good one, or morally right? But developing the theory itself was also influenced by strong views about what was wrong in their society. The conviction that, for example, some laws are bad resulted in analysis of why they were bad. And for Jeremy Bentham, what made them bad was their lack of utility, their tendency to lead to unhappiness and misery without any compensating happiness. If a law or an action doesn't do any good, then it isn't any good. On to Jeremy Bentham in detail. So he was born in 1748 and died in 1832. He was influenced both by Hobbes' account of human nature and Hume's account of social utility. He famously held that humans were ruled by two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. We seek pleasure and the avoidance of pain. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Yet, he also promulgated the principle of utility as the standard of right action on the part of governments and individuals. Actions are approved when they are such as to promote happiness or pleasure, and disapproved of when they have a tendency to cause unhappiness or pain. Combine this criterion of rightness with a view that we should be actively trying to promote overall happiness, and one has a serious incompatibility with psychological egoism. Thus, his apparent endorsement of Hobbesian psychological egoism created problems in understanding his moral theory, since psychological egoism rules out acting to promote the overall well-being when that is incompatible with one's own. For the psychological egoist, that is not even a possibility. So, given ought implies can, it would follow that we are not obligated to act to promote overall well-being when that is incompatible with our own. This generates a serious tension in Bentham's thought, one that was drawn to his attention. He sometimes seemed to think that he could reconcile the two commitments empirically. That is, by noting that when people act to promote the good, they are helping themselves too. But this claim only serves to muddy the waters, since the standard understanding of psychological egoism and Bentham's own statement of his view identifies motives of action which are self-interested. Yet this seems again in conflict with his own specification of the method for making moral decisions, which is not to focus on self-interest. Indeed, the addition of extent as a parameter along which to measure pleasure produced distinguishes this approach from ethical egoism. Aware of the difficulty in later years, he seemed to pull back from a full-fledged commitment to psychological egoism, admitting that people do sometimes act benevolently with the overall good of humanity in mind. Bentham also benefited from Hume's work, though in many ways their approaches to moral philosophy were completely different. Hume rejected the egoistic view of human nature. Hume also focused on character evaluation in his system. Actions are significant as evidence of character, but only have this derivative significance. In moral evaluation, the main concern is that of character. Yet Bentham focused on act evaluation. There was a tendency, remarked on by J.B. Schneewind, for example, to move away from focus on character evaluation after Hume and towards act evaluation. Recall that Bentham was enormously interested in social reform. Indeed, reflection on what was morally problematic about laws and policies influenced his thinking on utility as a standard. When one legislates, however, one is legislating in support of or against certain actions. Character, that is, a person's true character, is known, if known at all, only by that person. If one finds the opacity, if the will thesis plausible, then character, while theoretically very interesting, isn't a practical focus for legislation. Further, as Schneewind notes, there was an increasing sense that focus on character would actually be disruptive, socially, particularly if one's view was that a person who didn't agree with one on a moral issues was defective in terms of his or her character. as opposed to simply making a mistake reflected in action. But Bentham does take from Hume the view that utility is the measure of virtue, that is, utility more broadly construed than Hume's actual usage of the term. This is because Hume made a distinction between pleasure that the perception of virtue generates in the observer and social utility, which consisted in a traits having tangible benefits for society, any instance of which may or may not generate pleasure in the observer. But Bentham is not simply reformulating a Humean position. He's merely been influenced by Hume's arguments to see pleasure as a measure or standard of moral value. So why not move from pleasurable responses to traits to pleasure as a kind of consequence which is good and in relation to which actions are morally right or wrong? Bentham, in making this move, avoids a problem for Hume. On Hume's view, it seems that the response, corrected to be sure, determines the trait's quality as a virtue or vice. But on Bentham's view, the action is morally good, right virtuous in view of the consequences it generates, the pleasure or utility it produces, which could be completely independent of what our responses are to the traits. So, unless Hume endorses a kind of ideal observer test for virtue, it will be harder for him to account for how it is people make mistakes in evaluations of virtue and vice. Bentham, on the other hand, can say that people may not respond to the action's good qualities. Perhaps they don't perceive the good effects. But as long as there are these good effects which are on balance better than the effects of any alternative course of action, then the action is the right one. Rhetorically, anyway, one can see why this is an important move for Bentham to be able to make. He was a social reformer. He felt that people often had responses to certain actions of pleasure or disgust that did not reflect anything morally significant at all. Indeed, in his discussions of homosexuality, for example, he explicitly notes that antipathy is not sufficient reason to legislate against a practice. The circumstances from which this antipathy may have taken its rise may be worth inquiring to. One is the physical antipathy to the offense. The act is to the highest degree odious and disgusting, that is, not to the man who does it, for he does it only because it gives him pleasure, but to one who thinks of it. Be it so, but what is that to him? Bentham, then, notes that people are prone to use their physical antipathy as a pretext to transition to moral antipathy and the attending desire to punish the persons who offend their taste. This is illegitimate on his view for a variety of reasons, one of which is that to punish a person for violations of taste, or on the basis of prejudice, would result in a runaway punishment. One should never know where to stop. The prejudice in question can be dealt with by showing it to be ill-grounded. This reduces the antipathy to the act in question. This demonstrates an optimism in Bentham. If a pain can be demonstrated to be based on false beliefs, then he believes that it can be altered or at the very least assuaged and reduced. This is distinct from the view that a pain or pleasure based on a false belief should be discounted. Bentham does not believe the latter. Thus, Bentham's hedonism is a very straightforward hedonism. The one intrinsic good is pleasure, the bad is pain. We are to promote pleasure and act to reduce pain. When called upon to make a moral decision, one measures an action's value with respect to pleasure and pain according to the following: intensity, how strong the pleasure or pain is; duration, how long it lasts; certainty, how likely the pleasure or pain is to be the result of the action; proximity, how close the sensation will be to performance of the action; fecundity, how likely it is to lead to further pleasures or pains; purity, how much intermixture there is with the other sensation. One also considers extent, the number of people affected by the action. Keeping track of all these parameters can be complicated and time-consuming. Bentham does not recommend that they figure into every act of moral deliberation because of the efficiency costs which need to be considered. Experience can guide us. We know that the pleasure of kicking someone is generally outweighed by the pain inflicted on that person, so such calculations, when confronted with a temptation to kick someone, are unnecessary. It is reasonable to judge it wrong on the basis of past experience or consensus. One can use rules of thumb to guide action, but these rules are overreadable when abiding by them would conflict with the promotion of the good. Bentham's view was surprising to many at the time, at least in part because he viewed the moral quality of an action to be determined instrumentally. It isn't so much that there is a particular kind of action that is intrinsically wrong. Actions that are wrong simply in virtue of their effects, thus instrumentally wrong. This cut against the view that there are some actions that, by their very nature, are just wrong, regardless of their effects. Some may be wrong because they violate liberty or autonomy. Again, Bentham would view liberty and autonomy as good, but good instrumentally, not intrinsically. Thus, any action deemed wrong due to a violation of autonomy is derivatively wrong on instrumental grounds as well. This is interesting in moral philosophy, as it is far removed from the Kantian approach to moral evaluation as well as from natural law approaches. It is also interesting in terms of political philosophy and social policy. On Bentham's view, the law is not monolithic and immutable. Since effects of a given policy may change, the moral quality of the policy may change as well. Nancy Rosenblum noted that for Bentham, one doesn't simply decide on good laws and leave it at that. Law-making must be recognized as a continual process in response to diverse and changing desires that require adjustment. A law that is good at one point in time may be a bad law at some other point in time. Thus, lawmakers have to be sensitive to changing social circumstances. To be fair to Bentham's critics, of course they are free to agree with him that this is the case in many situations, just not all, and that there is still a subset of laws that reflect the fact that some actions just are intrinsically wrong regardless of consequences. Bentham is in the much more difficult position of arguing that effects are all they are to moral evaluation of action and policy. On to John Stuart Mill. He was born in 1806 and died in 1873. He was a follower of Bentham, and through most of his life greatly admired Bentham's work, even though he disagreed with some of Bentham's claims, particularly on the nature of happiness. Bentham, recall, had held that there were no qualitative differences between pleasures, only quantitative ones. This left him open to a variety of criticisms. First, Bentham's hedonism was too egalitarian. Simple-minded pleasures, sensual pleasures, were just as good, at least interestingly, than more sophisticated and complex pleasures. The pleasure of drinking a beer in front of the TV surely doesn't rate as highly as the pleasure one gets solving a complicated math problem, or reading a poem, or listening to Mozart. Second, Bentham's view that there were no qualitative differences in pleasures also left him open to the complaint that, on his view, human pleasures were of no more value than animal pleasures, and third, committed him to the corollary that the moral status of animals, tied to their sentience, was the same as that of humans. While harming a puppy and harming a person are both bad, however, most people had the view that harming the person was worse. Mill thought changes to the theory that could accommodate those sorts of intuitions. To this end, Mill's hedonism was influenced by perfectionist intuitions. There are some pleasures that are more fitting than others. Intellectual pleasures are of a higher, better sort than the ones that are merely sensual and that we share with animals. To some, this seems to mean that Mill really wasn't a hedonistic utilitarian. His view of the good did radically depart from Bentham's view. However, like Bentham, the good still consists in pleasure. It is still a psychological state. There is certainly that similarity. Further, the basic structures of the theories are the same. While it is true that Mill is more comfortable with notions like rights, this does not mean that he, in actuality, rejected utilitarianism. The rationale for all the rights he recognizes is utilitarian. Mill's proof of the claim that intellectual pleasures are better in kind than others, though is highly suspect, he doesn't attempt a mere appeal to raw intuition. Instead, he argues that those persons who have experienced both view the higher as better than the lower. Who would rather be a happy oyster living an enormously long life than a person living a normal life? Or to use his most famous example, it is better to be Socrates, dissatisfied, than a fool satisfied. In this way, Mill was able to solve a problem for utilitarianism. Mill also argued that the principle could be proven using another rather notorious argument. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. In like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. If the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. Mill then continues to argue that people desire happiness, the utilitarian end, and that the general happiness is a good to the aggregate of all persons. G.E. Moore criticized this as fallacious. He argued that it rested on an obvious ambiguity. Mill has made as naive and artless a use of the naturalistic fallacy as anybody could desire. Good, he tells us, means desirable, and you can only find out what is desirable by seeking to find out what is actually desired. The fact is that desirable does not mean able to be desired, as visible means able to be seen. The desirable means simply what ought to be desired or deserves to be desired, just as the detestable means not what can be but what ought to be detested. It should be noted, however, that Mill was offering this as an alternative to Bentham's view, which had been itself criticized as a swing morality, locating the good in pleasure in a kind of indiscriminate way. The distinctions he makes strike many as intuitively plausible ones. Bentham, however, can accommodate many of the same intuitions within his system. This is because he notes that there are a variety of parameters along which we quantitatively measure pleasure. Intensity and duration are just two of those. His complete list is the following: intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, propinquity and remoteness, fecundity, purity and extent. Thus, what Mill calls the intellectual pleasures will score more highly than the sensual ones along several parameters, and this could give us reason to prefer those pleasures. But it is a quantitative, not a qualitative reason on Bentham's view. When a student decides to study for an exam rather than go to a party, for example, she is making the best decision even though she is sacrificing short-term pleasure. That's because studying for the exam, Bentham could argue, scores higher in terms of the long-term pleasures doing well in school lead to, as well as the fecundity of the pleasure in leading to yet other pleasures. However, Bentham will have to concede that the very happy oyster that lives a very long time could, in principle, have a better life than a normal human. Mill's version of utilitarianism differed from Bentham's also in that he placed weight on the effectiveness of internal sanctions. Emotions like guilt and remorse, which serve to regulate our actions, this is an offshoot of the different view of human nature adopted by Mill. We are the sorts of beings that have social feelings for others, not just ourselves. We care about them, and when we perceive harms to them, this causes painful experiences in us. When one perceives oneself to be the agent of that harm, the negative emotions are centered on the shelf. One feels guilt for what one has done, not for what one sees another doing. Like external forms of punishment, internal sanctions are instrumentally very important to appropriate action. Mill also held that natural features of human psychology, such as conscience and a sense of justice, underwrite motivation. The sense of justice, for example, results from very natural impulses. Part of this sense involves a desire to punish those who have harmed others, and this desire in turn is a spontaneous outgrowth from two sentiments, both in the highest degree natural, the impulse of self-defense and the feeling of sympathy. Of course, he goes on, the justification must be a separate issue. The feelings is there naturally, but it is our enlarged sense or capacity to include the welfare of others into our considerations and make intelligent decisions that gives it the right normative force. Like Bentham, Mill thought to use utilitarianism to inform law and social policy. The aim of increasing happiness underlies his arguments for women's suffrage of free speech. We can be said to have certain rights then, but those rights are underwritten by utility. If one can show that a purported right or duty is harmful, then one has shown that it is not genuine. One of Mill's most famous arguments to this effect can be found in his writing on women's suffrage when he discusses the ideal marriage of partners, noting that the ideal exists between individuals of cultivated faculties who influence each other equally. Improving the social status of women was important because they were capable of these cultivated faculties, and denying them access to education and other opportunities for development is foregoing a significant source of happiness. Further, the men who would deny women the opportunity for education, self-improvement, and political expression do so out of base motives, and the resulting pleasures are not ones that are of the best sort. Bentham and Mill both attacked social traditions that were justified by appeals to natural orders. The correct appeal is to utility itself. Traditions often turned out to be relics of barbarous times, and appeals to nature as a form of justification were just ways to try rationalize continued deference to those relics in the latter part of the 20th century. Some writers criticized utilitarianism for its failure to accommodate virtue evaluation. However, though virtue is not the central normative concept in Mill's theory, it is an extremely important one. In chapter 4 of Utilitarianism, Mill noted, "Does the utilitarian doctrine deny that people desire virtue or maintain that virtue is not a thing to be desired? The very reverse. It maintains not only that virtue is to be desired, but also that it is to be desired disinterestedly for itself." Whatever may be the opinion of utilitarian moralists as to the original conditions by which virtue is made virtue, they not only place virtue as the very head of things, which are good as a means to the ultimate end, but they also recognize as a psychological fact the possibility of its being to the individual a good in itself without looking to any end beyond it, and hold that the mind is not in a right state, not in a state conformable to utility, not in the state most conducive to the general happiness, unless it does love virtue in this manner. In utilitarianism, Mill argues that virtue not only has instrumental value, but is constitutive of the good life. A person without virtue is morally lacking, is not as able to promote the good. However, this view of virtue is somewhat complicated by rather cryptic remarks Mill makes about virtue in his A System of Logic, in the section in which he discusses the art of life. There he seems to associate virtue with aesthetics, and morality is reserved for the sphere of right or duty. Wendy Donner notes that separating virtue from right allows Mill to solve another problem for the theory, the demandingness problem. This is the problem that holds that if we ought to maximize utility, if that is the right thing to do, then doing right requires enormous sacrifices, and that requiring such sacrifices is too demanding. With duties, on Mill's view, it is important that we get compliance, and that justifies coercion. In the case of virtue, however, virtuous actions are those which it is for the general interest that they remain free. So that's it for this video. If you found it useful, give it a thumbs up and do subscribe to our channel, where we offer free materials that you can use as part of your studies to really get a better grasp of specific areas you might find challenging. Make sure to visit our website as well, where you'll find useful revision guides, model answers, and tools to get top marks. Thank you for listening.